You know, bootlegs and unlicensed games have always gotten a bit of a bad reputation, which is why last year I made a video covering bootleg games that are actually good. Well, today I'm back with yet another selection of games that are worth your time. So, let's get started. This is Zook Hero Z for the Game Boy Color by the king of Game Boy bootlegs, Vast Fame. And as you can see, this is a Mega Man bootleg. In this game, you play as Zook, a police officer whom, while trying to stop not Dr. Wily here, was struck down, and was then robocopped into becoming Zook Hero Z. And man, this game is super impressive. It looks the part, it sounds the part, and it mostly plays the part. I say mostly because there are a few differences from Mega Man, like how Zook has both the wall grabbing and dash maneuvers from Mega Man X, but also the slide maneuver from the mainline Mega Man series. But more importantly, Zook's physics are a lot floatier than Mega Man's. I mean, don't get me wrong, the game still plays great, but the jumping feels very different from Mega Man. But Zook's design is so similar to Capcom's Blue Bomber that my monkey brain always defaults to that series instead. As Zook, you have 6 robot masters to take down, and you get their weapons when you defeat them. The weapons are pretty nice, and are obviously inspired by Mega Man, with some bosses being weaker against certain attacks. Not only that, but you also collect armor upgrades similar to Mega Man X. And if you collect the arm upgrade, you get to charge your special weapons to release more powerful versions of that attack. Although really, in my opinion, the bubble shot is the most powerful weapon in the game. You don't even need to charge it. That thing is powerful enough as is and can take out just about everything in your path. And the game even culminates with you attacking Dr. Miley Cyrus's fortress and taking him out. Another interesting thing about this game is that it's using the Game Boy Mega Man 5 sound engine, but the songs are all original. And in fact, they're actually really good, though some sound effects will cut off parts of the music. It's pretty clear that Vast Fame were huge Mega Man fans, as this often feels like a love letter to the Blue Bomber. And in fact, Zook is a highly respected game within bootleg gaming circles. It really does show that Vast Fame could have been an official studio if they had the chance. But the truth is, most bootleg and unlicensed game developers come from countries that were not officially supported by Sega or Nintendo, so they had to make do. And the game was so successful that it got multiple sequels and spin-offs, culminating with Zookman ZX4 for the Game Boy Advance, which, yeah, we don't talk about that one.
Brother, what's that? What's that, brother?
I should point out that there's also an English release of the game, but sadly, it's a bad dump, as the game will crash after a certain point, so you're better off playing the Japanese release. Although, you should probably stick to using emulators, because Zook games tend to fetch insane prices. Yikes! But really, Zook Hero Z is a great game in its own right. It's not quite as good as Mega Man, but it's still a genuinely good game that surpasses a lot of official releases. Check it out if you can. This is Buzz and Waldog for the NES, a South Korean unlicensed game by the same makers of Metal Force. And this game is basically an exploratory platformer that took a lot of inspiration from Mario 3. I mean, for one thing, a lot of the graphics and level design were lifted straight from Mario, though the sound engine was taken from Konami's NES Tiny Toons video games. Your goal is to explore the levels and find all the keys, so you'll have to jump, run, and enter doors to find them. And as you destroy blocks, you'll find power-ups, the first of which gives you a double jump, and the second allows you to fall down slower, similar to the cape in Mario World. And if you get hit, rather than losing all power-ups, you're instead downgraded a level. So if you have both power-ups, you'll simply lose the floating ability, but still retain the double jump. And that's a good thing too, because some of these levels are impossible without the double jump. I mean, granted, most times you can usually get by if you jump onto an enemy and then use that momentum to gain speed and altitude. But the double jump really makes your life easier, to the point where it might be better to lose a life and try again. Thankfully, the game is actually pretty generous with power-ups and extra lives, so even if you do make a mistake, it's generally pretty easy to either retry or look for a different power-up. And at the end of each world, you fight against a boss, which are usually pretty easy as well. Just pick up on their pattern and attack, that's basically it. Now, in South Korea, where the game was originally called Koko's Adventure, you could choose between a boy or a girl, but the version I'm playing is based on a Western release that would end up being cancelled, where they changed the girl character to whatever this is. Overall though, this game is actually pretty good. The graphics are definitely above average for the system, and the music isn't bad, though it does repeat a little too soon for my taste. But it's still a surprisingly good game. Check it out if you can. This is Evil Stone for arcades, and it's an action platformer that uses the Taito L system hardware without Taito's permission. A portal to hell has been opened, unleashing all sorts of demons, and you're a monk who needs to take them down and save the earth. So you'll be jumping between platforms, fighting enemies, bosses, and collecting power-ups. The jumping might seem a little odd at first, but it's actually quite easy once you get used to it. Basically, the game will always land you on a nearby platform provided you don't jump onto an empty spot. But some platforms can crumble or enemies can be waiting there to trap you. And the idea is that you do not take damage in this game. Yes, it does not matter if enemies or bosses hit you. What does matter is that you're not pushed off a block. Basically, if an enemy hits you, you're knocked back. And if there's no platform there, you lose a life. Thankfully, you can kick enemies or charge attacks, and taking down foes will drop power-ups, and if you collect enough of them, your attacks will be upgraded. The cool thing is that even if you do lose a life or continue, you still get to keep all the upgrades you've gotten. So if you want, you can actually just sit tight and farm enemies for their power-ups until you're fully powered up, and then move on forward. I mean, at one point, we even start firing triple Kamehameha waves, so that's pretty cool. This is a pretty fun game, and if you saw it on an arcade, you'd never guess it was unlicensed. I've honestly played a lot of official arcade games that were way worse than this. Check it out if you can. This is Fire Emblem: The Reincarnation of Fire and Light for the Game Boy Color, a Fire Emblem bootleg that takes enemies and designs from a bit of everything actually. I mean, I posted a screenshot on Twitter and people were recognizing elements from Fire Emblem 5, Fire Emblem 6, and the first map is actually taken from Fire Emblem 1 for the NES, though I do not recognize a lot of the other maps, so they're either original or taken from other games in the series. But with all of that said, how is the game? Actually, it's really good. All of the core series mechanics are here. The combat, the weapon triangle, visiting villages, different ground types give you defense bonuses, and staying on fortresses partially heals your character. The one interesting difference is that when you level up, the game does not automatically pick the stats for you, but rather, you select which stats you want to increase. One issue this game has is that it does not tell you if different round types or weapon types perform better or worse against someone. You just have to memorize the before and after stats to see if they're working as intended, which as far as I can tell, yes they are. And there's also no relationships or romance mechanics, although you do get money and get to visit shops between levels to buy gear and items. Sadly though, as you can tell, the game is in Chinese. I did download an English patch that turns most buttons into English, but the story elements remain in their original language. If only there was a way we could play this in English. Well, maybe we can, because this is Langrisser 2 Fantastic Simulated Battle for the Game Boy Color, and it's the exact same game, only now it's running under a Langrisser coat of paint. Except this version has also been fully translated into English. I mean, well, it is slightly broken machine-translated English, but English all the same. The sprites, backgrounds, and portraits might have been changed, but the core gameplay mechanics are still Fire Emblem. But you can tell that this was a rushed job, because the character portraits are not as well done here and the battle animations suffer from hit detection issues. The worst part though is that the game is constantly crashing, so either this was a bad dump, an emulator issue, or the original Langrisser version is just that buggy. Which is weird because the Fire Emblem one runs perfectly. So you have a version that runs perfectly but is in Chinese, and an English version that suffers from various bugs and crashes. I am honestly surprised that no one has taken the script from the English version and simply slapped it onto the stable Chinese version. As it is though, even if you don't speak the language, the basic existing English patch for Fire Emblem is more than enough to play through the game. And I had a great time playing this one. Fire Emblem was such a fun game. Check it out if you can. This is Tiny Toon's Adventure 6 for the NES, and this is a colorized port of Konami's Game Boy game, Tiny Toon's Babs' Big Break, which is a platformer in which you can change between Buster, Plucky, and whatever the pig's name was, by hitting the pause button, and each one fires different projectile types. And I can't believe I'm about to say this, but I think this bootleg NES port controls better than the Konami original. Look, I grew up playing the original Game Boy game, but playing it now, the game feels a little slow and floaty, which in turn makes the experience a bit too easy for my taste. But the NES version feels snappier. I don't know, call me crazy, but I like the way this one handles better. One interesting gameplay change is that if you walk in the same direction for a few seconds, your character starts sprinting, which I also like because, again, it makes the pacing way snappier. But it also makes the game a bit more challenging, but not unfairly so. But that's not all, because the developers actually made it so that now you can only make some of these jumps if you start sprinting, which I am honestly impressed. You don't often see bootleg developers adding new mechanics to existing games and then tweaking the level design to ensure that you actually use those new mechanics. Good job there, Hummer Team. I am honestly impressed. I would even go as far as to say that some of these songs here are better. I think that Tiny Toon's theme is a little better on the NES than the Game Boy. But you don't expect a bootleg game to put up a decent fight against a Konami game in the music department. Unfortunately though, there are some things that hold this port back. The first is that a lot of content was cut, like this boss fight against Dizzy and this pipe section. And that's a shame too, because the Dizzy boss fight was arguably the best one in the entire game. And some parts of the game no longer work as intended, like how you cannot enter this pipe by jumping on enemies anymore, and instead you now need to go around the level. I'm really torn on this one, because there are a lot of things about this NES port that I like better than the original, but I don't like how so much content was cut from a game that was already short to begin with. At least the minigames were kept intact. I am gonna say that if all of the content from the original game were here, this would have been the definitive version of Babs' Big Break. As it is though, it's still a surprisingly good bootleg game that stands toe-to-toe with the Konami original, and that is an achievement unto itself. Check it out if you can. This is Water Margin, a beat-em-up for the Sega Mega Drive, which originally stole music from Final Fantasy VI and sound effects from Streets of Rage 2. Though I am playing a modern re-release of the game that fixed these, though it still missed some, like how this sound effect is still clearly taken from Golden Axe. Anyway, this is a beat-em-up set in ancient China, and you can choose between 3 different characters. You have your standard combo, a special attack that drains a little health, an attack that propels enemies off the screen for a little crowd control, and you can also collect tokens that let you cast different screen clearing spells. And the fighting feels really good, with satisfying hits on your enemies while they put up a decent fight without being too cheap. Although I should point out that the game always defaults to the easiest difficulty, so you might wanna change that. And the production values for Water Margin are honestly impressive. The characters are large and detailed, the game allows for a pretty decent number of on-screen enemies, and the backgrounds are quite nice. Even the music is really good, and you even get a bit of story between levels. But the game seems to assume that you're already familiar with the original Chinese novel, because I have no idea what's going on. If this game had gotten an official launch, you never would have guessed it was a bootleg. It's just a really good beat-em-up. I mean, it's no Streets of Rage, but it's honestly better than a lot of official games on the system. This is a game that wears its Golden Axe and Knights of the Round inspirations on its sleeve, and it's all the better for it. So why say, check it out if you can. This is Queen Fighter 2000 for the Game Boy Color, and this is a fighting game based on SNK's Gauss Fighters for the Neo Geo Pocket Color, created by the king of Game Boy Color bootlegs, Vast Fame. And this is honestly one of the best fighting games on the Game Boy Color, official or not. Partly because it's using the King of Fighters Game Boy engine, except it's been reverse engineered to run on the Game Boy Color. This also explains why the fighting feels so good, because if you've ever played any Game Boy fighting game that makes use of this engine, you'll notice that the speed, controls, and hit detection are leagues ahead of its competition. And the same holds true here. Except now, with the additional power of the Game Boy Color, it allows for larger and more detailed sprites, making this a very impressive game for the system. Much like the King of Fighters series, you can pick between one-on-one or 3-on-3 battles, the latter of which is a feature which isn't even present on the Neo Geo Pocket Color original. The game also lets you pick from a multitude of characters from the King of Fighters series, though their names were changed for whatever reason. And in fact, some characters even went through complete redesigns that serve as a snapshot of the anime and gaming industry during the late 90s, like how King is now Renoa from Final Fantasy VIII, and Athena is basically Cart Cardcaptor Sakura. Oh, but wait! There's more, because the bootlegging does not stop there. Because they also added in Morrigan from Darkstalkers, who is now a sexy nurse for some reason, as well as a female version of Ryu from Street Fighter. Add to that how easy it is to pull off special moves, and the fact that this game has both counters and super moves, and what you have here is one of the best fighting games on the Game Boy Color. It's insane to think how if we were to make a list of the best fighting games for the Game Boy and Game Boy Color, half of them would have been bootlegs, and Queen Fighters 2000 would definitely be up there. Check it out if you can. This is MiG-29 Soviet Fighter for the NES by Codemasters. Codemasters were a pretty prominent software house for 8-bit home computers back in the day, but for whatever reason, all of their NES releases were launched without Nintendo's consent, and Nintendo even took them to court because of this. And one of their unlicensed games was MiG-29 Soviet Fighter. And as you can see, this is an Afterburner style game in which you need to take down planes for points while dodging enemy fire. Although, unlike Afterburner, you cannot fire missiles. The game also has a fuel gauge, and when it goes down, you then enter a minigame in which you have 30 seconds to dock with the resupply plane. Doing this refuels your plane but also gives you upgrades to your weapons. And at the end of each mission, you have to fight against the boss, and if you manage to take it down, you get yet another upgrade to your weapons. And once that's done, you must now land your plane safely. At first I thought this would be an impossible task like the infamous Top Gun landing strip, but it's actually pretty easy, and managing a successful landing earns you yet another weapon upgrade. And from that point on, you'd probably think you just rinse and repeat until you beat the game, right? Well, actually, no, because once you reach level 2, the game suddenly becomes a traditional shmup in which you can move in any direction you want. Oh, and remember those weapon upgrades you've been collecting? You can now switch between them with a press of a button and pick the best one for each situation. And if you're hit, you then lose one of the upgrades but keep the rest. Like, damn, this is a really ambitious game for the NES, which is also helped by the graphics, which are pretty good for the system, and the music, which is honestly fantastic. Why this game does not get mentioned more often is beyond me, because MiG-29 is a true hidden gem for the NES. Check it out if you can. This is Castlevania Reincarnation for Java phones, from back when phones used to have physical keypads. And this is a Metroidvania-style game inspired by the GBA games and Symphony of the Night. Heck, your main character even looks like a cross between Alucard and Soma Cruz. The story is that Dracula is resurrecting once again, although Dracula looks a lot different than I remember. And you are some random teenager who's been summoned to stop him. So I guess this is Castlevania the Isekai. And similarly to Soma Cruz, you also absorb the souls of the enemies you defeat, though here it just means you gain experience and level up. And just like the Metroidvania games, you can equip gear, use items, learn magic like shooting fireballs, as well as skills that let you traverse through the maps like a double jump, gliding, sliding, and you can even transform into a wolf similarly to Alucard. So once again, you're basically a combination of Soma Cruz and Alucard. I guess we're just going with the rule of cool here. And as you level up, you become stronger and gain points that you can use towards improving your current magic spells or learning new ones. And as far as I can tell, every song in this game was lifted from various Castlevania games, which are now played in glorious mid-2000s MIDI tunes. Heck, sometimes they have the same song twice, but with different MIDI renditions. The controls here are a little on the stiff side, but that's actually because this game was made for a phone keypad instead of a controller like I'm playing here, so it does take some adjusting. But then again, the controls here are far better than most of the official Castlevania games Konami did release for Java phones. One interesting thing about this game is that the original Chinese title was actually Prince of Queen Millennium Reincarnation, but the game was then partially translated to Russian and sold over there as Castlevania Reincarnation, and the English patch I'm using is based on this Russian release, which is why parts of the game are still in Chinese. But even if this isn't titled after Castlevania, it does not change the fact that its soundtrack was clearly taken from that series, or that a lot of these sprites seem to have been directly ripped or traced over original Castlevania sprites. At the end of the day though, this is still a really impressive Castlevania game for Java phones, and it's honestly better than a lot of official Java Castlevania games. Check it out if you can. This is True Three Kingdoms for the Game Boy Color by Syntax, and this is basically a bootleg Dynasty Warriors for the 8-bit handheld. You pick from 4 possible characters, all of which are from the Dynasty Warriors series, and then go on a series of battles defeating everyone in a beat-em-up style. The first thing I gotta point out is that the graphics are really good for the Game Boy Color, featuring large colorful sprites and good animations. I mean, for context, look at how Batman Beyond, an official beat-em-up for the system, looks much worse than this bootleg. But the good news don't end at the graphics, as your characters also have a variety of moves available to them. You have your basic combo, you can run an attack, but you also have special moves that are pulled off by doing Street Fighter-like button inputs. And the game is even kind enough to show you which moves you can pull off after selecting your character. Sadly though, it does not tell you how to pull them off. And as far as I know, there are no scans of the manuals or guides that I can use to look them up, so I could only pull off about half of the special moves. All of this by itself already makes the game impressive, but Dynasty Warriors has yet another interesting gameplay mechanic, and that is that you get experience with each attack you connect with your enemies, and once you get enough experience, you level up, making your attack stronger and your health more resilient. Not only that, but larger combo chains net you more experience bonuses. This is honestly a really good beat-em-up for the Game Boy Color, and in fact, I would not be surprised if this were the best beat-em-up on that system, mostly because the Game Boy Color only got a handful of official beat-em-ups, and most of them weren't that good to begin with. And I say it's a real crime that this never got an official release. Do yourself a favor and check this one out. But we're not done yet, because Dynasty Warriors would get a sequel also by Syntax. And this is basically the same game, but with new levels and a few tweaks to the gameplay. For one thing, your character roster has now been expanded from 4 characters to 6, and they all retain their Street Fighter-like button inputs. The experience and level up system are back too, but now you get experience points for defeating enemies instead of connecting hits, though you can still earn extra experience for doing large combos, but I feel it's not quite as noticeable here. One interesting new addition to this game is that you now have an inventory screen where you can use items like throwing daggers, knives, screen clearing spells, or drink potions. And you also gain the ability to parry and counter attacks, which actually improves the combat flow considerably. And as you defeat enemies, they'll occasionally drop money, which you can then spend between missions while visiting shops. Here, you can buy permanent attack and defense upgrades, as well as extra lives and inventory items. Other than that, yeah, this is pretty much the same game as the first one, with a lot of the graphics and music being reused between games. My biggest criticism with Dynasty Warriors 2 is that the levels are now twice as long as they need to be. Yeah, I don't know why they did this, but even with the new gameplay mechanics, after a while, the level just starts to feel like a slog. They do try to throw in more variety this time around, including environmental hazards like arrows and falling boulders. But at the end of the day, Dynasty Warriors 2 has better mechanics, while the first game had better pacing. But despite that, this is still one of the best beat-em-ups for the system, official or not. I think I like the first one a little better, but check this one out if you can. This is Brave Battle Saga for the Sega Mega Drive, also known as Final Fantasy in some areas. Yes, some regions try to pass this game off as an official Final Fantasy game. Anyway, this is a turn-based RPG strongly inspired by Final Fantasy and Breath of Fire. I mean, the battle screens alone are almost directly lifted from Breath of Fire 2. In Brave Battle Saga, the humans are at war with the invading monsters, and you play as Tim, a teenager who is banned from his village for a crime he did not commit. And from there on, you must travel around the world, build up your party, and visit the various elemental temples for their secret treasures that the monsters are trying to get. As you wander around the world, you'll find enemies walking around, and if you bump into them, it triggers a battle. And you can also buy gear and spells on the shops. Though, do be careful, as there are not enough spell slots for everyone to have every spell, so be sure to spread them out a bit. Personally, I think the weakest part of the game is its story, in that it's a little too basic for its own good, with your main party just being the generic good guys with some classic anime tropes thrown in. But the game makes up for it by having really fun combat. I mean, it's very clearly inspired by Final Fantasy, but it does a great job at making battles interesting while feeling epic, and the production values are really good for the system. Hell, they're better than a lot of official RPGs for the Mega Drive back in the day, featuring good music and some really impressive graphics. Don't get me wrong, this is no Phantasy Star 4 or Final Fantasy 6, but it's still a pretty good JRPG that would have been well received back in the day had it been launched officially. And in fact, if you do watch this game running, you wouldn't even guess that it's a bootleg. So I say, check it out if you can. This is Rolling Thunder for the NES, an official port of the Namco arcade game that was launched in the West by Tengen without Nintendo's permission. At this point, I think the history between Tengen and Nintendo is pretty well known. But long story short, Tengen was not happy with Nintendo's rules for third-party publishers, and so they devised a way to circumvent the NES lockout chip and launched a slew of unlicensed games for the system. And one of them was Namco's Rolling Thunder, a run-and-gun platformer in which you can jump between two different planes to avoid enemies. The plot is that the evil King Piccolo has kidnapped your partner, and you must now stop this evil organization and rescue her. So you can jump and fire at enemies, but your ammo is limited, so you gotta manage it however well you can. Luckily, there's a few doors you can go to replenish your ammo and even get an MG. And you can jump between planes to avoid enemies or fight different sets of enemies. And that's pretty much it, really. Yeah, the game is kinda simple, but it really is fun, and it went on to inspire Sega's Shinobi series. Between missions, you also get a few cutscenes on the status of your partner. And I gotta say, I don't think Nintendo of America would be okay with these cutscenes, because they can be kinda suggestive. Heck, in some cases the NES port somehow manages to be even more suggestive than their arcade counterparts. But hey, maybe that's just me. Still, I gotta say, I quite like this game. It's a little too difficult and a little too short for its own good, but that's really just the Rolling Thunder series in general. So I say, check it out if you can. This is Bubble Bath Babes for the NES, and it's most likely the most well-known bootleg in this video. This is a puzzle game in which you have to connect 4 of the same bubble color, though the game has 2 modes. One where you begin with an empty board and must clear a set number of bubbles to move on, and the other where the level already begins with a board filled with bubbles and you must clear any bubbles that have letters on it. This might all sound pretty easy, but the game has an interesting mechanic that makes it deceptively difficult. And that is, when you place a group of bubbles, the adjacent ones will not go down the board, not even when they're free from the remaining group. So as a result, it basically works the opposite of games like Tetris or Puzzle Bobble. So the board can quickly become filled with empty bubbles, and those can take quite a bit of time and effort to clear, though you can move your pieces into those empty bubbles if you wish. And that's pretty much it, really. As you progress through the game, you'll be given increasingly spicy images followed by the most undecipherable English I've ever seen. What the hell is she even saying here? This is a pretty simple puzzle game, but it does achieve what it set out to do. It's not great, but it's pretty decent. This is King of Ring for the Game Boy Color, a Lord of the Rings bootleg by Syntax. And this game is an action RPG with some Metroidvania elements. You start the game playing as Frodo and you're in an overworld, and you can visit areas which then turn the game into a side-scrolling action platformer. From there on, you have to find Gandalf, as well as Aragorn and Legolas, and when you do, they join your party. And you can switch between party members by hitting the pause menu, with each character having their own strengths and weaknesses. And you then need to progress through the game by making use of their abilities. So for example, Frodo can crawl through small spaces, while Aragorn can break walls, and Legolas here can walk over waterfalls. Gandalf on the other hand can cast spells like healing, or he can rain fire from the skies to clear all enemies. Not only that, but as you explore the game, you'll find permanent upgrades for each character, with items like power gauntlets that allow Aragorn to break larger boulders, as well as defense vests that let you take less damage, and the sword that makes Frodo not completely useless in combat. Yeah, the combat is a bit weird in this game, mostly because it only ever feels good with Aragorn, whereas Frodo's and Legolas's attacks are too weak for my taste, making them more of a liability, whereas Gandalf is only ever really good if you can fire from a safe distance. But then again, you can simply choose to jump over most enemies and avoid them if you want. Some of the enemy designs do feel a bit out of place here, but the backgrounds and character animations are pretty good, and the music is also really good in a few places. It's not a perfect game, but the Metroidvania and party-based mechanics work really well here, and the above-average graphics and audio also help. King of Ring is honestly pretty janky, but pretty fun. And I say, check it out if you can. But why stop at one Lord of the Rings bootleg when we can have two, with Lord of the Rings: The Return of the King for the Game Boy Advance by vast fame. And this is an overhead shooter with just the most incredible character designs I've ever seen. I mean, just look at this! Ah yes, Tolkien's Lord of the Rings, my favorite anime. Hell, look at the enemies! Remember that time Gandalf was in the desert fighting giant snowmen and snake women dressed like Japanese schoolgirls? Even the terribly broken English is just incredible! With brilliant dialogue like one introversion hobbit's Rogens got a ring with his cousin Bilbo, or how Gandalf is called Grande Grande in this game, and they mistake their ring to Judgment Day Mountain. Oh man, this is just incredible! So, how is the game? Well, it's actually pretty good. You select from one of 4 characters and then go around the various levels defeating enemies and collecting power-ups, though each time you get hit, your power-up level goes down. But by the time you become fully powered, you're pretty much unstoppable. And if that's not enough, you also got a screen-clearing attack that wipes out all enemies on screen. Man, what is it with Lord of the Rings bootlegs and giving Gandalf the power of nukes? You also have a melee attack which can instantly defeat enemies or even swat away enemy projectiles. And if this is starting to sound like Pocky and Rocky to you, then yes! That's because this game is using the same engine as Pocky and Rocky with Becky for the GBA. And you might think that Vast Fame simply stole the engine, but actually, no! If rumors are to be believed, they actually bought the engine from Natsume. It really goes to show you that Vast Fame wanted to go legit at some point, but simply never could. As it is though, it's a pretty fun game, even if it's not quite as good as Pocky and Rocky. This is Stunt Buggies for the NES, another unlicensed game by Codemasters. And this one is a maze game similar to Rally X or Pac-Man. So the idea is that you go around the map and collect all the bombs before returning to your starting point and then move on to the next level. But levels are guarded by other vehicles, and at first, they're just going to wander around aimlessly, but once they find you, they start chasing you. And you can either try to lose them or drop oil behind you which stuns them for a second. Not only that, but the levels have quite a few hazards thrown in. From water sources or traps to slippery ground that prevents you and your foes from making turns. And even items that can be used as barriers against other cars. Not only that, but the game rewards you with extra points if you pick up the bombs in the correct order. Which, let's be honest here, Stunt Buggies is the type of game you play for points, so it does pay off to do that. The levels are also quite big, which is why it's a good thing that you have a handy mini-map with you at all times. And yeah, that's pretty much it really. I will say that the graphics are pretty good for the NES, with the maps being pretty detailed and featuring large sprites. And the music is also pretty good, though nothing you'd listen to outside of the game. Overall though, this is actually a pretty fun maze game for the NES. And once again, it's a game that if you played it without any context, you'd never guess it was unlicensed. So I say, check it out if you can. This is Final Fantasy VII for the NES. Yes, really! And it's a turn-based RPG that attempts to more or less recreate the combat and storyline of the PlayStation game on the 8-bit NES. And as far as I can tell, this seems to be using the engine from either Final Fantasy II or Final Fantasy III, albeit heavily modified. With that said though, Midgard is a lot less cyberpunky in this version and a lot more medieval, as it reuses a lot of assets from the NES Final Fantasy games. And I gotta say, It's super interesting to see how the game uses a system very similar to the materia system from Final Fantasy VII. I was honestly having a ton of fun with this game, but unfortunately, once I blew up the first reactor core and reached the first town, the game kept crashing on me. I don't know if it's an emulator issue or something wrong with the game itself, but I simply could not progress. If only there was a way I could keep playing this. Well, maybe I can, because this is Final Fantasy VII for the NES, and this is the same game as before, except that now, a few fans took it upon themselves to clean up the game of any bugs and crashes it might have, while also changing the graphics and soundtrack to more closely resemble the PlayStation game. So what you end up with is a game that is part bootleg and part ROM hack. And not gonna lie, this is super impressive for the NES. The amount of cutscenes and set pieces from Final Fantasy VII that have been lovingly recreated here is honestly insane. I mean, they did have to cut off some of them. This is the NES after all. But I got as far as the Honeybee Inn and most of it was there. Yes, including the part where you dress Cloud as a girl. That is insane! But that's enough about the story. So, how is the game? It's honestly really good. Combat is turn-based and you control a party of 3 characters just like in Final Fantasy VII. Each character can equip a materia and the more you use it, the more experience that materia gains. And as the materia levels up, it gains new and more powerful spells. Which so far, this works a lot like the materia system from Final Fantasy VII, though there are a few differences here. For one thing, spells and weapons also gain experience the more you use them. And once the character's expertise with a spell or weapon is maxed, you can go to a store and level them up. So this means you can have a Bolt 1 spell that is level 5, or a Bolt 2 spell that is level 1 for example. One odd thing about this game is that no matter where you are, all the enemies you fight are randomized. So this means that you can be at the start of the game and run into random battles where you fight endgame enemies and vice versa. The difference is that those enemies will be the appropriate level for whatever zone you're in. So if you're doing the first reactor run for example, you could run into some endgame enemies, but they'll all be level 1. So it just means they'll take a bit longer to take down than some goblins for example. Because of this, Final Fantasy VII for the NES has a bit of an inverted difficulty curve, where it's more difficult at the start, but the more you progress, the easier the game becomes. I mean, heck! By the time I began unlocking the second tier of spells, I was kind of one-shotting and two-shotting every encounter that wasn't a boss. Regardless, this was one of those games where I had to force myself to stop, because I was enjoying Final Fantasy VII far more than I thought I would. Obviously, it doesn't beat the original, but I will say that it's a lot more enjoyable and a more streamlined experience than a lot of official RPGs from back in the day. So I say, check it out if you can. And there you go, a selection of good bootleg games for you to play. Are there any games I missed? Let me know in the comments. In the meantime, I'd like to thank Ankos and the Spacetime Starbeast Discord server for helping me research this video, as well as all my Patreon supporters, including my newest backers, Bruce East Cruz Jr., Normal L, B Pinalone Dialam, Tim Broughton, Maldo19, Olana Kendry, David, Ovalai, Edward Phillips, Tim Petro, and Sergio Rodriguez. Thank you for helping make the channel better. Anyway, I hope you have a great day. Bye!